Peace be with you. Friends, our first reading for this weekend is taken from one of the strangest books in the Bible, the Book of Cohaileth. It's known in older Bibles as the Book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I say the book is strange because it has almost nothing nice to say. It's not at all what you'd expect from a biblical book. It's a very dark, very pessimistic view on life. It's the work of an old man. So Cohaileth, that's the name that he goes by. It just means the kind of the churchman or the assemblyman. But he describes himself as an old man who has seen it all, done it all, experienced it all. And he comes out with this word of wisdom: vanity of vanities. All is vanity. The scholars tell us the Hebrew behind that is something like air or bubble. It just means everything is insubstantial. Cohaileth has had wealth. He's had power. He's had pleasure. He's had material goods. He's had knowledge. Mind you, there's a tradition that says that Cohaileth is Solomon himself. King Solomon, the end of his life, looking back at his long career. Well, think of someone like Solomon, who was known for his wisdom as well as his wealth and power and so on. So Cohaileth had all this, and yet he concludes, listen, there's nothing new under the sun. Sun comes up, sun goes down again. All is vanity. Some have rendered that phrase as a chase after wind. Evanescent, passing, insubstantial, like a bubble. By the way, one of the most famous passages in the whole Bible is from the Book of Cohaileth, the one that's in that song by the Byrds. To everything there's a season. To everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season. There's a time for war, a time for peace, a time for love, a time for hate, a time for gathering, a time for scattering. And people say it was a very poetic line, but see, think about that passage. It's reflective of this man's rather dismal consciousness. Things come, things go, there's this, there's that, and we don't really get anywhere. That's very much in line with Cohaileth's point of view. Now, the passage for today, it's a very brief section. I would urge you, by the way, to read this book when you have a chance. It's not very long. You can read it easily in one sitting. But the passage for today includes this curmudgeonly observation. Here's one who's labored with wisdom and knowledge and skill, and yet to another who has not labored over it, he must leave his property. I wonder how many older people feel that way. It's here I've spent my whole life laboring away, using my clever mind and using all my powers and everything. And now at the end, I'm going to pass away and I'll leave all this to some ne'er-do-well. Some stupid ne'er-do-well who's never done a day's work in his life, and he's going to get my property. Things come, things go. What's life all about? At the end of the day, not much. That's the kind of despairing point of view of Cohaileth. Everything, animals, plants, mountains, the sun, the planets, ourselves, none of it lasts forever. All of it is eventually swallowed up. Young people often don't fully realize this, but old folks do. Old folks resonate very much with Cohaileth. The young, with their beautiful bodies, at the height of their strength, full of ambition, full of the future, they don't understand this. They can be seduced into thinking that this world is it. But Cohaileth knows better. Now, if I can put it in terms of a pithy spiritual lesson, here's what he knows. Who you are is always more important than what you have. Let me say that again. I think it's the distillation of the spiritual wisdom here. Why this book, with all of its despair, is in the Bible. Who you are is always more important than what you have. Why? For who you are will last forever. What you have will fade away. Gosh, the Bible tells us this story over and over again. Who you are is a matter of your moral and spiritual character. It's a matter, if you want, of the soul. It's a matter of how you stand before God. See, friends, the soul lasts forever, who you are. But what you have, honors, wealth, connections, titles, degrees, all that will fade away. Another way to put this, who you are, you will take into the next life. What you have will be left behind. Cohaileth is telling us this deep and abiding truth that possessions are ultimately vanity. They're a chase after the wind. Now, the gospel parable that Jesus tells is making much the same point. Jesus effectively mocks the man who relied on his possessions to give him security and to give him joy. He tells a story about this man who is already very wealthy. Mind you, in the ancient world, these people were very rare. It's just the very tip-top of society you found very wealthy people. Wealth had not been distributed the way it has in more modern societies. So this man's very wealthy. And his wealth has just increased. He's had a good harvest. So what does he do? He resolves to tear down the barns he has and build bigger ones. Read this now in 21st century terms as get a bigger bank account, have a more creative and wide-ranging investment portfolio. Tear down the old barns and build new ones. Then, this devastating assessment on the part of the rich man. Listen, as for me, I've got many good things stored up for many years, and so rest, eat, drink, and be merry. See, there it is. There is the spiritual lie. Namely, that my possessions will make me happy and secure. You know, it seems like such an obvious lesson, doesn't it? But we all fall into this trap. What will make me happy and secure? Almost by instinct, we say some version of possessions. The reason I'm insecure is I don't have enough money. That's it. The reason I'm insecure is I don't have enough honors. I don't have enough titles. I don't have enough connections. I don't have enough political clout. Whatever it happens to be, we convince ourselves that the more we have, the happier we'll be. Well, it just is not true. Listen now to Jesus as he continues this parable. The Lord says to the rich man, "You fool, for this night your life will be demanded of you." Mind you, your life. What's he talking about? Not what you have, but who you are. This night, your soul, your heart, your life, who you are will be required of you. Thus, Jesus says, it will be for all who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God. Wow, there's the hinge, isn't it? There's the hinge. Thus it will be for all you who think your possessions will give you security, but remain poor in what matters to God. What matters to God is the quality of your heart, the quality of your soul. What matters to God is our character. What is it? What is it? I describe it this way. Your character is that heart which has been developing through a whole series of moral choices, either for or against love. Let me repeat that. Who you are, your soul, your heart, your character, it's what's been developing throughout your life through a whole series of moral choices, either for or against love. Think about it, friends. At every moment of the day, practically, we're faced with a choice. To love or to fall into self-absorption. Just go through your day, do an examination of conscience, and think of all the moments during the day when you are faced with a choice. Either to love, to will the good of the other, or to fall into self-absorption, to defend yourself, to cling to yourself, to seek possessions. John Paul II, Karl Wojtyła, in his moral writings, talked about every moral act does two things. It produces some effect in the world, and at the same time, it helps to create the one who performs it. It makes you the kind of person you are becoming. Does that make sense? So you do something. You choose, whether it's to love or to fall back in yourself. It's making you who you are. Now, with that in mind, let's glance at our second reading from Paul to the Colossians. Paul says, quote, "Put to death, then, the parts of you that are earthly." What does he mean? He means the parts of you that are obsessed with the goods of this world. The parts of you that are obsessed with possessions and which are therefore resistant to love. He gets, in fact, very specific. Listen again. Immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, the greed that is idolatry. See, to be immoral, immorality, is to resist the path of love. To be impure, what does that mean? But to turn one's sexual energies in on oneself. To have evil desire is to want to harm another rather than to love him. To be idolatrous, Paul calls beautifully the greed that is idolatry. What is that? It's to honor as highest something other than love. Because love is what God is. Whenever I say, eat, drink, and be merry, whenever I say, if I get enough of this, enough wealth, enough pleasure, enough power, I am committing what the Bible calls idolatry. I'm finding my ultimate joy in something less than love, because love is what God is. Then Paul says, having taken off that old self, that earthly self, the self that Cohaileth got so much wisdom about at the end of his life, Paul says, put on a new one. Listen, which is being renewed in the image of its creator. There's the whole story. There's the heart of it. What God wants is to share his life with us so that we might become like him and reflect the wonder of his being. The old self, the earthly self, is the one obsessed with possessions, what I've got. The new self, Christ living in you, is the self ordered to love. And Paul says when you've got that self, then you are renewed in the image of your Creator. These readings are great this week. They all point to that question. Who are you? It matters infinitely more than what you have. Even though the world is telling us in 1,000 ways what we have is the key question, it is not. Read Cohaileth on that again if you have any doubts. What matters is who you are. You must be someone conformed to the image of God. And God bless you.
Peace be with you. Friends, we've come now to the very end of the liturgical year, to the great feast of Christ the King. It's exceptionally difficult for us, with our deeply democratic sensibilities, to enter sympathetically into this feast, because we don't particularly like kings in our culture. Let's face it, our nation was formed in a great act of rebellion against the tyranny of a king. Our whole system of government evolved in such a way as to hold off any claim to absolute or king-like authority. But I think, friends, we have to get over this reticence. For kingship is a central symbol for the Bible. And one of the primary ways that biblical authors attempted to express the significance of Jesus. So we have to do a little act of cultural transplantation and get back into the time of Jesus. Keep in mind that ancient peoples took kingship for granted. Even the little tribes of the Amorites and the Jebusites and the Amalekites had kings. We think of them today probably as more like street gangs, these little roving bands of warriors, but even they had kings, the Bible says. And of course, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, all had kings. It was just the way things were structured. At a key moment in its history, Israel asked for a king. God warned them against it. Look in 1 Samuel to find the evidence here. But they persisted, and so God gave them Saul, the first king of Israel, who turned out, of course, to be a disaster. But Saul was succeeded by arguably the greatest hero in Israelite history, David the king. David, despite his faults, brought the country together, defeated its enemies, established its capital in Jerusalem, and resolved to build the temple as the place of right praise. This great heroic figure emerges precisely as a king who accomplished these great things. He was the focal point around whom the holy people were gathered. He was their head. He was their leader. Now, keep reading the biblical history. You find out that in the wake of David, the kings of Israel became weak and corrupt, and they allowed the nation to fall into degradation, to be overrun by foreign powers. And so, the people Israel began to dream of a new David, a new king who would do everything David had done, but on an even grander scale. They hoped that this new king would unite the nation definitively, cleanse the temple finally, defeat Israel's enemies completely, and then reign over the whole world as all the nations are brought to the worship of the true God. Now, look back in the Old Testament. You'll find over and over again this great messianic hope, a hope for the Mashiach, the anointed one. Keep in mind that David, as a young kid, was anointed by Samuel. He is a Mashiach, an anointed one. The new David, the new king, they hoped, they dreamed, they prayed, would one day arrive. It's only against this very rich and complex background that we can begin to appreciate what Jesus was doing and how he was perceived. The first words out of his mouth and the central theme of his preaching concerned the kingdom of God. Right away, we're in Davidic territory here. A kingdom is being announced, a new reign, a new order, centered on himself. Right away, of course, these were perceived quite rightly as fighting words. For if a new kingdom is coming, what? The old kingdoms have to give way. If a new king has arrived, the old kings have to cede. Don't we hear that precisely in the beginning of the Gospels? When even the baby Jesus arrives, Herod and with him all Jerusalem tremble. That's the arrival of the new king, the arrival of a new kingdom. Just as a sidelight, whenever you pray the familiar Lord's Prayer and you say those words, they probably just pass through your mind. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. You see, you're praying that the old kingdoms be supplanted. That's why that prayer is properly revolutionary. Now, what does Jesus do, having announced the kingdom? He endeavored to do exactly what David had done, to unite the nation, to bring the tribes back together. This was the point, as I've been saying now for many months, of his open table fellowship. Jesus' still surprising, still shocking outreach to sinners, tax collectors, his inclusion of the sick and the marginalized. That was Jesus now, the new David, gathering in the tribes. Then, at the end of his life, He comes into David's city, the city of Jerusalem, and he cleansed the temple. Well, in some ways, exactly what David had done. David establishes the temple as a place of right praise. Jesus cleanses now the corrupt temple and promises that he will establish a new one. I will tear down this place and 3 days rebuild it. He was referring to the temple of his body. And as we've seen throughout his life and ministry, Jesus opposed the old kings. Now, think of David surrounded by the Philistines, the Amalekites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, all the great enemies of Israel. And David's continually fighting them. We see something very similar now in Jesus, though he fights in a very unexpected way. Think of those infancy narratives. Matthew and Luke set them up as a tale of two kings. Jesus is presented as the great alternative to Quirinius and Augustus. Even as he arrives as a baby, he frightens Herod, and by extension, he frightens Quirinius and Augustus. The old order is being set up as a kind of rival to Jesus, and throughout his public ministry, he will confront them. Now, this confrontation between the old and new orders, this confrontation between the old kingdoms of the world and the new kingdom, comes to its highest expression as Jesus stands before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, the local representative of Caesar Augustus. And this is our gospel for today, the feast of Christ the King. Pilate, undoubtedly sure of his power and authority, sizes up the criminal in front of him. Probably with a smile on his lips, maybe a bit of a sneer. He says, "So you're the king of the Jews." Now, Pilate meant this, of course, in a purely political, purely worldly way. So you're the one trying to seize political control of this part of the Roman Empire. Mind you, Pilate knew about such pretenders to power. There were all kinds of revolutionaries, all kinds of kings proposing themselves. But this scene now is packed with irony, which you often find in John's Gospel. For any Jew would have known the full import of Pilate's question. He was really asking, "Are you the king of all the world?" Because again, the expectation was when the new David came, he would be the king of the Jews and by extension the king of the world. He would draw all the nations to the praise of the true God. What Pilate's saying, therefore, is, are you the new David, destined to reign over all the nations? We have to attend now very carefully to how Jesus answers him. He tells him straightforwardly enough, "My kingdom does not belong to this world." So important, isn't it? The reign that he has been announcing from the beginning, this kingdom of God, is not a new political order, based like all the others on threats and violence. This is why now he immediately clarifies that his attendants are not fighting to keep him from being handed over. No, the reign of God that he announces is a reign of nonviolence and the compassionate ordering of things. Think of his table fellowship. Think of his outreach. Think of his love for the poor. All of that now is the very nature of this new order. Well, Pilate, a purely political player, is unimpressed with all this spiritual talk. "What is the truth?" he says, when Jesus says, "I've come to witness to the truth." And then he coldly condemns Jesus to death. Pilate's playing the typical Roman game, the typical worldly game of power politics. And by all appearances, he's won, as ruthless and violent people always seem to win. As he sends Jesus off to be crucified, anybody watching the scene would say, well, there's that poor dreamer, that poor alternate king now being led off to be killed. But then the supreme irony, upon which our Christian faith depends, which is the central proclamation of this feast day. Through the cross and resurrection, Jesus, in fact, defeated Pilate. The new king outmaneuvered the violence of sin, swallowing it up in the divine forgiveness. Jesus took on the full weight of the Roman Empire, the full weight of human sin and dysfunction, and swallowed them up in the divine forgiveness. And that's how he defeated the enemies of Israel. That's how he fought as the Davidic warrior. Now look how it comes together. And John is so clear on this. He also, in the same act, established his own body as the new temple. That's why blood and water flowed forth from it. Furthermore, he gathered all people to himself as the Davidic king was expected to. John says, when the Son of Man is raised up, he will draw all people to himself. In other words, we see he is the new king. He is the one to whom final allegiance is due. And this is why, too, in that final irony, it was Pilate himself who announced this kingship as the prophets predicted to all the world, putting on that cross in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He knew who the new king was. We know who the new king is. That's the point of this feast of Christ the King. And God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, we have a great privilege this weekend. The church gives us some wonderful readings all about marriage. So all those who are married should listen very carefully to these readings for this weekend. I think one of the most powerful contributions of Vatican II was a renewed emphasis on the theology and spirituality of marriage. For too long in the life of the church, marriage was seen as a kind of, second-rate vocation. Perhaps a state of life embraced by those who weren't up to the spiritual athletics of priesthood or religious life. Well, Vatican II in the years after convinced us that that's pretty much for the birds, that attitude. All people, married and unmarried, celibate, non-celibate, everybody, is called to holiness. Marriage is every bit as much a vocation or calling as the priesthood. Now, maybe you've heard that language, but it might just sort of flow through your mind. I'd like you to meditate in the course of this homily on that line, that marriage is a vocation, it is a calling, vocatio, from God. Married people are meant to work out their salvation in each other's presence. They're brought together for God's purposes. Now, to understand this, though, more fully, the church brings us back today to the very beginning, to that symbolically charged language of the book of Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve. God says, it's not good for the man to be alone. So he creates Adam first in this story, but then reflects, it's not right, it's not good that Adam is alone. This little line, I think, is loaded with theological significance. God, though he's one, right? So we believe in the one God. Though he's one, he's not alone. How come? Because God, we believe, is a community of persons, a play of love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God is love, as St. John told us. Human beings are made in his image and likeness, and thus human beings are not meant to be alone. Loneliness would be a kind of antitype of God's way of being. Communio, to use the Latin term, communion, being one with. That's the fundamental reality. That's the ground of being. That's what God is. When two human beings come together in this kind of intimacy, in this very deep friendship, they are mirroring the way that God is. Now we see a first dimension of it, of how marriage is a symbolic sign of God's way of being. Now there's more. Just as the Father and the Son are equal, and the love that they share, the Holy Spirit, is equal to them, so the first human being, and by extension the rest of us, needed an equal to whom he could relate. It's interesting, the pagan philosopher Aristotle referred to a friend as a second self. That's why Aristotle felt that you couldn't really be friends with someone who was inferior to you, someone who was below your level of intellect or maturity. It's only someone who is radically equal that could function as a second self, as a real friend. That's why now in the Genesis account, none of the animals is a suitable partner for Adam. Remember that beautiful scene that all the animals are brought before him and he names them, but it's very clear that none of them is his suitable partner. Why? Well, he can't relate on the same level intellectually, emotionally, culturally. But then we hear that from his rib, the first woman is made. Now, don't read that. I think it's very clear from the Genesis account. We're not meant to read that as Eve's inferiority, just the contrary. It's a sign of Eve's radical equality with Adam. When Adam sees her, he exults, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." See, marriage is this deepest and most authentic type of friendship. All friendship, all human sort of coming together represents the communio that God is, but now marriage is this friendship at the highest possible pitch. That's why it's one of the best signs that we have of God's way of being. We hear this next. A man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one flesh. Now, have you noticed how very vivid that line is? How sensual, and dare I say it, even sexy that line is. The two of them becoming one flesh. Beautiful way to express the reality of sexuality. There is in the Bible none of Plato's disdain for the body. And see, friends, you can find that in lots of spiritual traditions all over the world, a kind of suspicion of the body. And you can see, a fortiori, a suspicion of sexuality as something which draws us away from the spiritual. See, but that's just not biblical. Look how clear the Bible is, that from the very beginning, God intended these two, this man and woman, to come together in this great intimate friendship, which expresses itself in physical love. Now, look at up and down the Bible, how married love, sexual love, is a symbol of God's love for the world, is a symbol of the love that God is. Read again the Song of Songs if you doubt this idea. I want to bring that to the fore. You know who really saw it clearly and articulated it very well was John Paul II. Reread those wonderful Wednesday audience talks he gave on the theology of the body. It's all about this motif of how sexuality shouldn't draw us away from God, but sexuality is itself, listen, in its very physicality, is a sign of God's passionate love, which is why it belongs now so centrally to marriage. Now, here's the theme, though, I think is most important to garner from this Genesis account. Marriage is not a, quote, secular act or secular phenomenon. It's not merely a social arrangement. Rather, marriage has been brought about by God for God's purposes. It's ingredient in God's great plan for the human race. That is maybe the most important thing we learn from the Bible. See, you can find marriage, of course, in every culture on the planet. It's a social arrangement. It's got political overtones, cultural overtones, etc. The biblical perspective, though, is so clear that it's more than that. It's part of God's plan. When two people marry, they're being brought together by God for God's purposes. Okay. All of that, I think, is contained in that beautifully understated Genesis account. And with all those principles in mind, let's turn to the gospel. And the church juxtaposes this now with a very similar gospel. We hear the Pharisees trying, as usual, to trip Jesus up, ask him about divorce, which was then, as now, a vexed question. Moses, of course, had allowed divorce under certain circumstances, but even the Pharisees must have sensed there was something off about this. Jesus now, in answer to them, articulates his very strong teaching about the indissolubility of marriage. And mind you, he appeals to the very text we've been considering. He says God made them male and female, etc. He appeals directly to the famous Genesis text. And then he draws his famous conclusion, quote, "Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate." This sort of assertion, I would say, makes no sense within a purely secular context. If two human beings fall in love, enjoy one another's company, even have children together, etc., we could imagine them falling out of love, no longer enjoying each other's company, and therefore deciding to separate. However, and this is the hinge, friends, isn't it? If we place this reality within the context of a vocation from God, then everything changes. If we hold that it is indeed God who has brought a couple together, not just for their benefit, but for his purposes, to express symbolically who he is, to accomplish his purposes together, then we can't imagine that couple not being together. How come? Because God doesn't make mistakes. If God has caused you to say yes, he can't cause you later to say no. If marriage is only a political, social, cultural reality, maybe we could imagine it. This is why, by the way, the church, when it nullifies a marriage, is saying that a sacramental marriage, in that case, never existed. An annulment is not, as they say cynically, Catholic divorce. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that a particular couple was in fact not brought together according to God's designs. The church is simply acknowledging that fact when it states that a marriage is annulled. Let me say in conclusion just a few more things about this controversial matter of the indissolubility of marriage. Too often, I think, this law is seen as a kind of external imposition. The authoritarian church compelling people to conform to an impossible ideal. Once more, the church imposing itself on our freedom. But remember what G.K. Chesterton, the great Catholic author, said. He observed that when two people fall in love romantically, they're wont to say extravagant things. I will love you forever. I will forsake all others in order to have you. You are the center of my life. Now, again, easily enough, you can imagine two young people falling romantically in love say just those sort of things to each other. They don't say, well, yeah, I think I'll hang around with you for a while till someone better comes along. No, I mean, people are really in love romantically. They say these rather extravagant things. Chesterton observed this. The church is not imposing a law on people. It's simply ratifying this instinct. It's applauding it. It's recognizing that instinct as from God, and then raising it to a higher pitch, supernaturalizing it, helping the couple to see that this deep love they have for each other, which they are willing to pledge to each other romantically, is actually ingredient in a much higher love and exists for a much greater purpose. purpose, which, listen now, only intensifies, it should only intensify, their sense of the indissolubility of their love. I think that's where this idea of the indissolubility of marriage comes from. This is why it comes right up out of the heart of the church. Friends, spend some time this week looking at this very beginning of Genesis, reread this gospel, and exult in the fact that marriage is a great call to holiness. Marriage is a reality deeply blessed by God and reflective of the way God is. And God bless you. Peace be with you. Friends, our first reading for this weekend is one of the greatest and most devastating in the entire Bible. It has haunted the imagination of the world for 3,000 years. It stood, even more than the Exodus story, at the heart of the Israelite religious consciousness. It's called, among the Jews, the Aqedah. That's Hebrew for the binding. It refers to the binding of Isaac, Abraham preparing his own son for sacrifice. The great religious philosopher Soren Kierkegaard said this was the sublimest expression in all the literature of the world of the meaning of faith. Read Kierkegaard's great book called Fear and Trembling. That's where he talks about this scene. We know the outlines of the story pretty well. Abraham is asked by God, for no apparent reason, we're never given the reason for it, to sacrifice his son to him. His son, Isaac, the child of his old age, and more than that, the bearer of the promise. For all those years, all those decades, Yahweh had promised to Abraham, I will make you the father of many nations. Though he was an old man, though his wife was well past childbearing age, God promised, Abraham had faith. And then, against all odds, against all expectations, Isaac is born. Here was the son through whom God was going to fulfill his promise to Abraham. Therefore, and though the Bible doesn't give us the psychological details here, we can only guess at them. How utterly incredible, how utterly incomprehensible this must have been to Abraham. Though the Bible, as I say, is rather laconic here, the rabbinic commentators fill in the details of the story. How Abraham walked through 3 terrible days with his son to Mount Moriah, racked with agony and confusion. Can you imagine? Can you imagine walking with your young son? You know the purpose of this trip. He doesn't. He's probably enjoying the outing with his father. But all along, Abraham knows what's at stake. And then, on Mount Moriah, he hears that terrible question from his son. What will we sacrifice to the Lord? Where is the animal for sacrifice? How that must have torn at Abraham's heart. But the great patriarch goes through with it. He binds his son, the Aqedah, he binds him to the altar and raises the knife to kill him. And only at the last moment is he stopped. The angel tells him, the Lord has tested you and found you worthy. He knows that you are faithful to him. Now, friends, I would say this. If that story doesn't bug you at the deepest level, you have not been paying attention. That story is meant to get into the crevices and corners of your mind. It's meant to get into the nooks and crannies of your heart. It's meant to bug you and disturb you, to confuse you, to confound you. That was Kierkegaard's point, by the way. Any attempt to rationalize this story, to understand it, to figure it out, it's just not going to work. You know, a couple of years ago, a sort of mock trial was held. I think it was in New York City. Lawyers came forward to argue the case of Abraham. Was he guilty of attempted manslaughter? The verdict came back, yes. And, of course, wouldn't most of us agree with that? If you stumbled upon this scene, you saw a father raising a knife about to kill his son, wouldn't you stop him? And once you stopped him, wouldn't you arrest him? And wouldn't you charge him with a crime? What I love about this story is it shows the strangeness and religious seriousness of what we're talking about in the Bible. Well, how do we begin to understand it? How can we begin, anyway, to make some sense of it? Is God just capricious here, just cruel, toying with his people as a cat toys with a mouse? Does God test us in this finally arbitrary way? The answer to that, I think, is clearly no. What we have to do is we have to situate this story in the context of the great theological fact of creation. One of the most elemental affirmations about God in the Bible is that God is a creator. In fact, the creator of all that exists. Everything that exists is from God. And this means, friends, something given as a pure gift. As I've said many times before, God does not need the world in any way. God does not benefit from the world. Rather, he gives the totality of the world as a sheer grace. Whatever we have, therefore, whatever we are, is, as it were, on loan from God. It exists from God and totally for the purposes of God. How long do things exist? Precisely as long as God is pleased to allow them to exist. How long do we have what we have? Precisely as long as it pleases God to let us have them. We have talents and powers because God has deigned to give them to us. We breathe and we live because God is pleased to give us breath and life. Now, I know most of us we'd affirm that, sure, abstractly and theologically. Yeah, I know that's true. I think part of what it means to be a saint is not just to know the truth of that, but to live the truth of that. See, to let that truth sink into your bones, let it determine the way you live. We don't have or own or control anything. Everything exists in God and for God. To be a saint, to be a person of faith, is to know this and to live radically out of this consciousness. Let me say that again. I think it's the hinge for this story. To be a person of faith, and see, Abraham is the father of faith. He's the model of faith. To be a person of faith is to know this truth and to live radically out of this new consciousness. Now, I know the difficulty is so much of this is just counterintuitive. We like to be masters of our own domain. You know, we work hard for things, and so they belong to us. They're pleasing to us, and so we cling to them. We want them. We want to possess them and have them. But see, friends, the problem is this backs us into a difficult and dangerous spiritual corner. Here's why. No matter how much we think this is true, no matter how much we want it to be true, it just isn't. And if we don't adjust to it, listen now, life will force us to adjust to it. Why? All the goods that we have, all the talents that are ours, will eventually fade away. Oh, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, sometimes relatively fairly, sometimes unfairly. But no matter what, everything we have, everything we are, will in time be stripped from us. You know, the longer you live, the truer this is, isn't it? we come into our prime. We're able to do many things. We're in possession of many things. Wealth and talent, control, power. But then as you move through life, it's taken from you. You become weaker. Your talents are stripped from you. All that you have is gradually or suddenly taken. And all of it finally is taken away in the dreadful fact of death. We don't control anything finally. We don't own anything finally. All of being is on loan from God. To be a person of faith is to know this truth in one's bones and then actively to cooperate with it. Now, come back to the Abraham story. It means that one is willing to sacrifice, yes, even what one loves the most. One is willing to offer it back to God. And that is precisely what the sacrifice of Isaac is about. Abraham, in the most vivid way possible, acknowledging that Isaac was and is a gift, and so he's able to sacrifice him, to offer him to God. Now, you might be wondering, what really is the payoff of all of this? Even if I accept the metaphysical truth that all things are from God and ultimately for God, what does it benefit me to surrender to it? Maybe I should, like the existentialists, resist it. Maybe I should say, I know that's true. I don't have things forever. I know that death finally swallows it up. But maybe I should just shake my fist at the world. I should resist it as long as possible. The great message of the Bible is no to that. Why? Because your being increases in the measure that you give it back to God. Life actively surrendered to God is enhanced and multiplied. There's that law of the gift I've talked about before. Do you hear how this is affirmed in the first reading? Listen. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you, Abraham, acted as you did, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky. Now, friends, don't read this in some arbitrary way, as though God were just given this, or Abraham is given this reward for his surrender. Rather, read this as a kind of spiritual physics. When we let go of our lives and we give them to God, offering them for God's purposes, our lives become richer, more joyful, more abundant. God is not toying with us, not playing arbitrary games with us. Rather, through this great story, he's inviting us into a healthy spiritual stance. Think now, as we get Lent underway, everything you've got, everything you are, belongs finally not to you. It belongs to God. It's on loan to you. But be willing at every moment to offer it for God's purposes, turning it over to God. Then the high paradox. You will find your life much more joyful. You will find your life richer in the process. There, I think, friends, is the great spiritual lesson of this terrible story of the Aqedah. And God bless you.